Hello to everybody. I'm really very glad to be here and have this opportunity to join my experience and my knowledge about this subject and discuss with you. I started to be interested in this issue of land use regulation many years ago, almost 15 years ago. The fact was that I work a lot with many governments who are very much interested in housing and how to provide affordable housing all over in cities all over Latin America. And they were too much focused on housing finance, the construction of housing, without any interest and any regard to land policy. And what was the result of this? Well, the result was housing, social housing built in the periphery of the cities with very bad opportunities for social opportunities and economic opportunities for most of the population. We have very huge problems of housing affordability and the elasticity of land and housing supply. So I started to be very much interested in this subject. At the same time, in some developed countries like US and UK, at that time, it started, the academic research on land use regulation started to be very important. We have many urban economists working on the unintended effects of land use regulation. And in fact, you have here in US a White House paper that I think it was written in September 2016, that talks about the effects on housing affordability related to land use regulation. In UK, we have some papers too related to the Baker Review and many others, which relates very much the issue of inclusion and affordability to land use regulation. But in developing countries, I was working in this subject, and I was working on an invisible issue, the less sexiest issue in urban studies. But luckily, I have just come back from Kuala Lumpur and from the WUF, and what I saw is that the issue of land use regulation is giving much more interest in all these new urban agenda. It's the first time that we are talking about land. We were talking a lot about housing, but we were not talking about land. And land is a main topic. It has to do with how the cities are growing, with density, with extension, with affordability, with transportation too, and with these opportunities that the people in the city can enjoy, and with prosperity, with sustainability. So I'm here. I'm going to show you some theoretical concepts related to my, and then related them to my research. And at the last time of my presentation, I'm going to suggest some, what are some of the challenges and what can we do about the land use regulation in our city. So let's start the presentation in one slide. Three main parts of my presentation. The first one is the motivation. Why do we care about land use regulation, and why do we care about inclusion in many of our cities? The second part of the presentation, I'm going to present some stylized facts about land markets and land use regulation. What do planners need to know about land use regulation? In many of our cities, planning is seen about, we want the best city, we want the most beautiful city, we want very large plots with a lot of open space. And many times, all these issues are making the cities more, and have some unintended effects, and making cities more unaffordable. So we are going to look at what are the effects of land use regulation. For example, in informality, I've done a lot of research for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, now from the IDB Bank, about the effects of land use regulation on informality. And just to give you an example, you know what's the size of the minimum plot size in many cities in Latin America? Well, in my country, for example, the minimum plot size is 300 square meters. and the developer has to provide the complete infrastructure. You know, there's many people that cannot afford to buy a plot, a 300 square meter plot. So what do? Well, they occupy the plot, or in a 300 square meter plot, they build a lot of units, and all of those are informal. So there's an issue of land use regulation that it's driving informality, and we do, and in my research center we do a lot of research about that, and I'm going to share this with you. And the last issue is that, well, I'm going to talk about what can be some of these urban policy tools to improve affordability and inclusion. So, the how. So when we talk about inclusive housing, we are talking about three main things. First, the provision of infrastructure and services, an issue that we know that infrastructure is lagging well behind of extension and the growth of all our cities. Second, we are talking about social diverse neighborhoods. We need mixed income neighborhoods, and many cities are becoming less diverse in that sense. And the third thing, we need to provide all the opportunities that the people need to access labor markets. And when we build housing in the periphery of the cities, these people had very bad labor market opportunities, and there is this type of spatial mismatch where the main labor opportunities are located and where the people live, and they have very bad transportation and accessibility. So all these facts, infrastructure, mixed income neighborhoods, and accessibility are all related to land markets and land use regulation. That's why this topic is very important. And we know that there's a huge deficit on urban infrastructure. These are some facts about India, about number of households lacking toilet in their home and electricity. I'm not going to show all these measures, but what I want to say is that financing infrastructure is one very important issue. And in fact, we cannot increase density in our cities if we not have complete infrastructure, for example. The good thing about that is that there is a paradox. We can finance infrastructure with the benefits that it provides because it's capitalizing housing pricing, land and housing prices. So we can capture some of the increase in land and housing values that are provided by the provision of infrastructure to finance it. And the other thing, this is the city of Buenos Aires, and this is land prices map. The most expensive plots are located in the city center. This is a very monocentric city. And if you look at the spatial distribution of households by income, it reproduces exactly land prices. Most people who can afford more high-income people are located in the city center, or sometimes in some gated communities or in the periphery of the city, but most low-income people, all the red areas that you see in that map, are located in the periphery of the city. So this is a very strong relation between land markets and the distribution of households. And what we have in most of our cities, this is Santiago de Chile, Bogotá, but I can show you many other cities all over the world, where what we have is segregation by income. Higher income people living in the darker areas in these two cities, and the poor living always in very peripheral locations. So this is why we are very much concerned about the way in which land markets are working. And land use regulation is not, is getting these things worse, and I'm going to show that. So what we have is very divided cities. And these are two cities in Latin America. This is Sao Paulo, and this is a photograph that has traveled all over the world, where we see informal neighborhoods. What's the result of having very, very bad affordability and very, very bad land use regulation standards, very tight land use regulation? Well, what we have is that people occupy land and leave their houses informally. So, and they do whatever they can. This is a photograph of Sao Paulo, and this is another in Buenos Aires. This is a gated community in Buenos Aires, and people living informally at much higher densities than what the regulation indicates. And I'm going to talk more about that. So the solution that governments have found to provide housing at scale has been social housing. And we are building social housing in the periphery of the cities, in a very problematic location, with very bad access to opportunity. This is an example in Mexico, but we can see this is, for example, Santiago de Chile, and what is highlighted here is that all social housing is built in the periphery of the cities. And this is not a particular issue of Santiago de Chile. This is the common issue made all over the world in many, many other cities. And what happened with this is that we are perpetuating poverty. By building social housing in the periphery of the cities, what we are doing is we are restricting the opportunities of all these people. In fact, this social housing complex has been demolished in the last few years because of the main problems that it has provided to the city of Santiago. And here I want to show, this is a study that we do for the World Bank, I think 2 or 3 years ago, and we try to study the labor market access, traveling 1 hour in public transportation and traveling 1 hour in private cars. And this is the metropolitan area of Buenos Aires, and this is the density of employment. Here what we are saying is the density of employment. Look, we have very high employment density in the city center, and which is diminishing when we go farther from the city. So just take a look at this. This is an interactive map where we have all the city, and you put one point, for example, here, and you can know how many employment opportunities you can find by traveling 1 hour in public transportation and traveling 1 hour in private car. What we see here is if you live here in Merlo, which is in the greater metropolitan area, you can reach 4 million jobs by car in 1 hour and 1.5 million jobs traveling by public transportation in 1 hour. And you can know in which sectors of the industry you can find them. Look what happened if I live here in José C. Paz, and here is the city of Buenos Aires, and here are where the main social housing complexes are being built. What happens? You can access only to 15,000 jobs traveling by public transportation in 1 hour. And this happens in many other cities. So what's happening in our cities? When you have such low opportunities and such living in the periphery. This is one of the most important informal neighborhoods in Buenos Aires City. This is the Barrio 31, which is now being upgraded with a very huge investment from the national government and most multilateral organizations. Look, living informally here in the city center, you can reach almost 3 million jobs by public transportation in 1 hour. So there's a great incentive for people living informally in the city center. If we cannot provide a solution for people to live in places with good accessibility to all the opportunities, we are increasing informal housing in city centers, okay? And this is what happened in Villa 31. This is the Barrio 31, you know, this is the city center of the city, and you have high density neighborhood built inside the city center because it's the place where it provides the better opportunities for all. So informal settlements in this way are a lower price alternative for this type of low-income population, but they are lacking services, they are lacking formal tenancy rights, they are not regarding all the land use laws, environmental codes, building restrictions, and many times they occupy areas that are unsuitable and by environmental concerns and by other matters. These are the barriadas in Lima, for example, and I hope that you know which we grew a lot in Peru. These are the barrios de ranchos in Caracas. To give you a show, these are not quite different from what you can find in India and many other cities all over the world, where people build informal. People who has not access to the formal market build informally in the informal market. So, but at the same time, and you are talking about extension and expansion, and we have just written two studies, one both for the CAF, the Banco de Desarrollo de América Latina. One is published in the CAF report on urban growth and access to opportunities. The other one is what is the role of urban growth on inequality and segregation in Latin America. And one main issue of concern is that if our cities are growing very, very fast and are extending very fast, how does it affect inequality within the city and segregation? And to give you a quick look of how our cities, well, we analyze a lot of data, not only the Atlas of Urban Extension that Sol Angel has built, but we include many other cities and analyze a lot of cities in Latin America and how these cities had been growing. And we found this is, for example, urban extension and density. Density is all the red areas, and extension is the blue area of each map. This is in the in the year 2000, this is in 2010, and I'm going to show you it very fast, but what I want to show you is that most cities, for example, in Latin America, are growing very, very fast. This is Mexico, the federal district, this is Caracas, this is Santiago de Chile, this is Buenos Aires, and this is a comparative graph of how these cities have been extending in Latin America, North America, and Europe. This is based on the Atlas of Urban Expansion of Sol Angel. And what is interesting to see is on average, urban extension has been 43% of all the urban growth in Latin American cities. So for all the growth that Latin American cities present between 1990 and 2014, 43% of this growth has been urban extension. And what is more problematic, is that part of this growth has been by leapfrog and going further. If we are growing with the complete infrastructure, well, this will not be a very severe problem. But the problem is that our cities are growing without the complete infrastructure, and it's forcing governments to finance additional infrastructure. I think that the comparison is interesting. It's interesting to compare different continents too, because for our surprise, for example, Latin American cities are much more denser than comparable cities in Europe and comparable cities in, of course, in the United States. But the size of this extension is greater too. What we have, and when we put them, all this data in a graph, what we see is that all the points here are all the cities and the continents. What are showing is all the cities where density decreases, and all those are all the cities where density increases, which are really very few. So what we are finding is that density is decreasing all over in these 3 continents, in most of the cities in 3 continents. And for developing countries, this is problematic in one particular thing. We need to finance infrastructure in low density areas, which is quite impossible at this stage. So I think that these are very interesting facts that we want to redress in this study. In Argentina, we have the same. For example, this is the city of Catamarca, which is growing in 1 decade by a rate of 5% annual urban extension. The same in Jujuy, 4% annual urban extension rate. So, and again, infill extension and leapfrog in this case, on average, we have that only 27% of urban growth in Argentinian cities was due to infill, 53% was due to extension, and 20% was due to leapfrog. Okay, you can tell me, well, it does not matter if you have good accessibility. I'm going to talk about, I'm very, very much concerned about that the discussion of how much compact the city should be, or how much the city should have to extend, is not the right discussion. I think that we need to phrase it in terms of accessibility, or how people are allowed to access to all the opportunities and the services that they need. And what is happening in Argentina and in many of these cities that I show you in Latin America is that cities are growing, are extending at very low densities, and accessibility is very, very fast. You have complete provision of infrastructure and transportation inside the city, and as I show you in the map, it takes a lot of time to arrive to the city for all the people that's living in the periphery. So what we did in this study is we built some indicators of inequality, just a Gini coefficient, and a segregation, and some indications of segregation following some academic literature, which is the mostly suggested in these topics. We did it, but we did these 2 segregation and inequality indicators based on not only on income, on access to basic services, on tenure condition, on overcrowding, on education, and we have these indicators. And what did we find? Well, we found when we tried to relate the rate of urban growth that was observed in most of these cities and our indicators of inequality and segregation, what we found? Well, first, areas that have experienced greater urban extension are more unequal. 1 point, one interesting point. 2, we have segregation of the poor in all of the urban agglomerates. And in part, this segregation of the poor many times was due to the location of social housing. But in some big metropolitan areas, we also find segregation of the rich, which is an issue that is happening in many other cities all over the world. But the most important thing here is that we provide a very strong evidence that not all the patterns of urban development and built-up growth have the same effect. Leapfrog development appears to explain the greater segregation. So when our cities leapfrog, they generate extension that goes well beyond what the city has developed, it generates more segregation of the poor. And both infill and extension, these were very interesting results, are positively related to more homogeneous, less segregated urban agglomerations. So the issue of infill, the issue of trying to bring people to live in the city, it's one important issue for reducing segregation. And also we have some very important issue that I include this slide here, which I show many times in my lectures of urban economics, because the extension of our cities is not free in land prices. This is the basic gradient of land prices. This is the urban border, and this is the central business district. And every time the city increases, what we are doing is that we are increasing land prices all over the city. So this is an issue that we need to consider in particular. The other thing that is important in this is the issue of infrastructure. I want to comment on that. Why is important to provide complete infrastructure in the city? Because it has also an effect on land prices. 30 or 40 years ago, in many Latin American cities, if you want a telephone, to have a telephone line in your apartment, you need to pay at least a 20 or 30% more of the price of the house. I don't know if that was what that was here the same was here in US. Do you pay any time more for having a telephone? Well, when you don't have complete telephone infrastructure in a city, you are able and willing to pay much more to have this infrastructure. Do you follow me? Well, in cities where you don't have complete infrastructure, the lower price alternative is land and housing without infrastructure. But you are willing to pay a lot more not to have to live without infrastructure. So the cost of infrastructure is even higher because of this differential. So there's a very important economic issue that we need to achieve by providing complete infrastructure in our cities. It will have a very important effect on land prices. We do a lot of empirical analysis of the relationship between land use regulations and informality. And there are a few papers. Most of them were, we did a lot of them with generous funding from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. And we worked with the national government in Argentina and with the World Bank to try to test empirically what are the effects of land use regulation. But for doing that, first you have to have data on land use regulation. And not all the countries, not all the municipalities, not all the states collect data on such topics. So our first objective was to build a land use regulation database and to design a set of indicators of land use regulation. Here in US, you have a database on land use regulation, the Wharton Index, that is very much used by many researchers when they have to talk about the effects of land use regulation. Well, we try to copy this type of, we take the methodology of the Wharton Index of land use regulation, of residential land use regulation, and we try to build something very similar to that, but including some topics that are not common in developed countries, like the existence of informality, for example. So we build a database on land use regulation, and we try to assess empirically what are the effects of land use regulation on informality. And why land use regulation matters for informality? Well, land use regulation matters for many issues. First, because it determines what are the alternative patterns of urban structure in the city where people can live where people, where housing, if housing will be affordable or not. So we need to understand what are the unintended effects of this land use regulation. And take a look here. This is some explanation of something that I was telling you at the start of my presentation. This is the minimum plot size area in one municipality in any, this is Buenos Aires, but it can be many other cities in the world and in Latin America. And this is an informal neighborhood, and this is the size of the plot in which the people live. Okay? So people need to live at higher densities than what is determined by the land use zoning. So many cities, however, many cities enact their land use zoning here in US, but all in many other countries. Basically, what is the main objective of land use regulation? Well, to correct for externalities. You don't want to have a factory in front of housing or apartments, but many times this zoning has a lot of unintended effects. So not always land use regulation is enacted to be welfare enhancing, and this is an issue that we are learning in the last few years. Why? Well, because land use regulation reduces affordability, because it can restrict supply, it can make very tight land use regulation can restrict the supply of land and housing, making housing more, even less affordable. It can generate exclusion. You can totally ban social housing from some area, but you can also enact very large plots, banning all the people that cannot afford to buy that size of plot. It can drive informality, because if you set a minimum consumption level, like the 300 square meters or so, you are only if you have the amount of money to buy such plot, you are going to build your house in the formal market. And what is more important, if we are keeping low density areas inside the city, we are forcing unnecessary urban extension in many of our cities, and forcing the finance of urban infrastructure too. So there is another very important issue of land use regulation, and land use regulation provides perfect segregation by income. You are going to access a place in the city that you can afford, and many times there is a very important economist here in the US that's called Fisher that says, well, homeowners are home voters, are people who vote in a city with the value of their house. So they are going to oppose all the regulation that has some effects on that. So what we have is that in many cities, there is a strong community opposition to more mixed income neighborhoods. And this is an issue of concern in many cities in Latin America, and also I'm sure that here too. So many cities exclude lower income households because, well, they consume more public services and they pay less for that. So unless some inclusionary elements are explicitly enacted in the regulation. And here in the US, you have some very interesting instruments. For example, in Massachusetts, you have inclusionary zoning. You allow developers to build higher or at the higher densities, but they have to include a 15%, 20% of social housing, which will be allocated, for example, for households that have the 80% of the average income of the area or something like that. They are implementing this here in UK, in US, in New York, in the whole state of Massachusetts, in San Francisco, and many other areas. I think it's a good way to try to provide inclusion in many cities. What we have found is that many cities with very tight land use regulation are enacting exclusionary land use regulation. Why? Because they restrict the type of units to be developed, because they force overconsumption, the minimum plot size, and one very important issue is all the permitting process, all the authorities that are involved in the permitting process of housing, which makes it a lot of delays and very expensive. So not only the setbacks, the standards, the minimum plot size, but all the municipal and local process that are related to this, which are very important. And what's happening in most of these cities is that exclusionary land use regulation, the regulation is enacted thinking on the formal area of the cities, on what is the vision that we have for having a very nice and beautiful city. But we don't define areas catered for lower income groups. So one of the best things that we can do in all our cities is to monitor and review our land use regulation and try to think what are the affordability impacts for the different income groups. And also we have very high transaction costs, which makes housing even more unaffordable. Let me show you, for example, the difference in minimum plot sizes in different cities of Latin America. And these are very interesting because in Ciudad de Mexico, for example, the minimum plot size is about 75 square meters, while in other cities it's 300 or even 400. So there's a minimum consumption level that is set by the land use regulation, which is very important. And this is a very interesting fact because there are many households these are different cities. And what we are seeing here is households that cannot afford to buy a plot because their income is very low, but households that cannot afford to buy a plot because their income is low, but also because of the minimum plot size. And what we see is that we increase, not only people cannot afford because they have low income, but a lot of people cannot afford because of the minimum plot size. And this is an issue that many governments are being reviewing. For example, when we finish our study, this study working with the World Bank, well, many municipalities all over Argentina review their minimum plot size. They have lowered it to 1,070 square meters, and well, they are lowering standards in many areas in trying to make it land more affordable. The other thing is the share of developable land that you can have for a plot. And if you have a lot of setbacks and a lot of conditions, many times you reduce a lot what you can build, the size of construction that you can build in each plot, reducing the revenue or the possibility that the private sector, for example, build housing for lower income households. There is a very interesting paper that was written many years ago about the effect of reducing this type of standards in Malaysia and allowing developers to build in land, well-located land for lower income households. And here we have information about, this is the World Bank doing business survey, and these are not very updated data. This is from 2010, but the World Bank collects this information about doing business in all the cities of the world every year. And what we find here is what are the procedures to deal with construction permits. And we have here many Latin American countries, and we have Denmark, for example. And what we found is that you have to do a lot of processes to, for example, to deal with a construction permit or to register a property. So this is a fact that is not very much taken into consideration when you talk about the effects of land use regulation, but it's an issue that can be greatly released or improved, and in which the government can do a lot. For example, in Colombia, they have just implemented in Bogota only one process. If you want to build social housing, you have only one process in which you complain, you attend all the processes, and you don't have to spend years trying to obtain a permit for housing construction. And I'm going to spend a few minutes now talking about density and affordability, which is quite very important. And I'm going to do this with a model. This is the typical land price profile. You have very low land prices in the periphery of the city. In fact, because your transportation cost will be very, very high. And you have higher land prices when you live near the city center. This is distance from the city center, and you have very high or much higher prices in the city center because this trade-off of transportation cost and land prices make you that you pay more for land, but you pay less for transportation. And here we have two different income groups. One income group is able to pay $5,000 for land, and the other, B, is able to pay $20,000 for land. And this is the density that each income group can live, density and distance to the city center that each income group can live. So the affordable density, A can afford to live at 3 kilometers from the center at a minimum density of 2,020 inhabitants per hectare, while B, which can pay $20,000 for land, is able to live at a density, at 3 kilometers at a density of 60. Look what happens when I enact a land plan, which looks like this. We are constraining density in many parts of the city. This group has no problem, whichever they want to live. They are able to pay to live all over the city. But what we found is that this group will not be able to live here, 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 and they only will be able to live only here. So what is happening with this restriction in density in many areas of our city? Well, households has two alternatives. One alternative will be to bypass the effect of regulation and switch to the informal sector. The example that I show you about Barrio 31 in Buenos Aires, people living at very high densities. You remember one of the first slides that I show you, people living at very high densities just in the center of the city. Or they have to live in very, very, very peripheral locations. And what we found is that the group B, the group that has no constraints is not affected by the land use plans, will be a strong supporter of this type of zoning because it does not affect at all their location within the city, and in fact, it prevents Group A from overcrowding some areas of the city. So this is why keeping very low density areas inside the city can have also an effect on this type of households. So what we found is that these low-income households are pushed to the peripheries, I already told them, and foster very high density in slums in the city center. So, but we provide a lot of empirical evidence on the causal association between land use regulation and housing tenure choice. And remember, I told you that we built many land use indicators. We reproduced the Wharton Index, and we assembled this database for metropolitan areas of Argentina. Basically, our model was very simple. Well, there are a lot of socio-economic determinants that can affect the household's tenure choice, either formal or informal, to be a homeowner or a tenant in the formal market, or to be a homeowner or a tenant in the informal market. This can be like education, migrant status, demographic characteristics, but also land use regulation through the supply and prices and quantities can also have an effect. So we test this model, and what do we find? Well, first, a negative effect on formal tenure that is derived by the existence of land plans and zoning, which indicates that in many of the cities there was a minimum consumption level that sets the standard to allow to have access to the formal market very, very high. Second, infrastructure parameters and infrastructure finance instruments are positively related to allowing less informality in the city. The third issue that we found is that more authorities involved in process approvals are much more related to informality. The monetary time and cost in these processes are also related into informality. And what is very interesting was that municipalities that were implementing what we call access to land related instruments that have some value capture instruments in the regulation and implement this, because you can have a lot of issues, a lot of topics in your land use regulation, but you are not enforcing it, so it's the same as not having it. So municipalities that have access to land related instruments in the regulation, like value capture and inclusionary policies, seems to confirm the positive effects on formality. To go to the third part of my presentation. What are the urban policy tools to improve affordability and inclusion? First, about the issue of informality. First, we are working a lot on remedial policies. We have informality, we have tolerance to informal land development, followed by ex post upgrading and regularization and slum upgrading programs, which is unsustainable and which is insufficient. So we are treating only the symptoms of informality, but we are not doing nothing to prevent informal land development. So we have a big issue about this. And well, we were working in some ideas, and we are discussing this with several governments and multilateral organizations too. The first one is to cut, and we have just been in December last year in the municipality of Belo Horizonte and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil working on this topic, and they say, well, we are doing a lot of upgrading programs, a lot of them, and each day we have more people living in informality. So, and we cannot cope with that. So what can we do? And the first thing is, do you enforce some type of affordable payments for the services that you are provided in these settlements? No, we don't. We are not doing nothing. Well, okay. So the first thing is that you have to understand and try to find which will be the type of affordable payments that dwellers and households can do every time you have an upgrading program. I'm telling this because many governments are providing services for free, and people have a capacity and need to pay, even if it's just a few, for these services, in order to try to close, to revert this negative vicious cycle of informality. Additionally, we are trying to think about more appropriate titling schemes. For example, some cities are trying to look at community land trust. Why? Well, because if you allocate property rights, what's happening in many cities, and in cities in Argentina, we have a very interesting academic paper written about that. All over the years, when you go to a neighborhood 20 years ago, what's happening? Most of the households are, they sell the plot, they sell the house, they get divorced, and they are again informal. So we are studying some new type of titling schemes like leasehold, land, community land trust, communal ownership, and we have a few experiences and trying to find what are the impacts about that. The third thing is we can capture some part of the increases in land value that are caused by infrastructure if we include these neighborhoods. The second thing is try to improve some proper zoning. Zoning with lower standards like they did in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, in the SEIS, the zones for special interested. So you can reduce, you can change market expectations of supply by reducing these standards. The second is, as I explained with the telephone line, the land prices will tend to equalize if you complete the infrastructure provision. So we can help defray infrastructure costs by capturing part of the increase that the provision of infrastructure generates. And there is also a very interesting issue that prevents the retention of land inside the cities. We are forcing cities to expand infrastructure by keeping a lot of vacant plots inside the city. And in this sense, many governments in Latin America are implementing very interesting progressive property tax that has a higher rate for those households, for those plots that are vacant plots located inside the city center. So, and this is a very well-known graph that says, well, it's much more better to prevent and to provide infrastructure from the start than to go later and try to upgrade all these settlements, which in fact is quite more expensive for the governments and for society at all. I want to include one thing that is very important. Why do I care about land use regulation and its relation to housing, social housing, and housing finance policy? Well, because there is a common mistake in most cities of thinking about one issue and not the other. And you know what happens when there is an inappropriate supply of land and you are implementing some type of housing finance program. Well, when land use regulation is tight, I want to show you who benefits and who are the winners and who are the losers. This is very basic microeconomic, but what you have is, this is the demand with the credit, and when you increase, when you put more money in people that want to go to the market to buy a house or a plot, you are doing is you are increasing the demand. This is the demand with the credit program. But what we found is that land and housing supply in the short run is fixed. And more fixed if you have a very tight land use regulation, which makes that land supply is very inelastic. So the main effect of an increase in demand in when you enact or you promote a housing finance program and you have land use regulation very tight and the supply of land very inelastic, is that you are going to have an increase in land and housing prices. And this is an evidence that we have collected in many, many cities. So does a housing finance program which does not take into consideration land use regulation and the elasticity of land supply, increase housing access and affordability? Not at all. It increases land and housing prices, and it reduces housing access. And in fact, what we are seeing in many Latin American cities where this type of housing finance programs are being implemented is that people get a subsidy and a credit, and they cannot buy anything in the formal housing market because prices are increasing even more. So what is important to see is that the most benefit with this type of programs will be the existing homeowners. Not the homeowners, not the new homeowners, those that we are willing to support, neither renters. And in case public finance is being used, well, we are not expending it very well because we are benefit those that we are not intended to benefit. And in case taxation is not updated, these effects are reinforcing inequalities. So how we can expand supply of affordable housing? When I talk about urban infill and I talk about the back-end land taxation, for example, in some countries, back-end land is under tax. You don't pay nothing. You can have your plot in the middle of the city center and wait for the for increases in land prices, and you don't pay nothing for that. So back-end land capitalize future income and increases and the cost of infrastructure. So we need to tax them more heavily, and that's what many Latin American cities are doing with very good results. The other thing is that this issue that I show you about, well, how compact the city should be, how extended the city should be. So I'm favoring accessibility. I think the city can grow and have a lot of subcenters with good accessibility, and this will be good, or can be a monocentric compact city, but we have to put a great effort on these dense transit networks. And the other thing is, well, we can implement land value capture tools. This is one of the main issues that have come in the new urban agenda. In fact, in Kuala Lumpur, I participate and moderate a meeting in which all the multilateral organizations were participating with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy to discuss, well, what are we doing about value capture instruments all over the world, and what can we do, and what is the knowledge that we still need to raise to make this possible. So what type of land value capture tools are we talking about? Well, betterment contributions is one thing, land pooling and land adjustment, which is in fact being implemented with different results, more successful, less successful in different cities. The action of building rights, we are giving building rights for free. Cities are densifying, for example, and I take the example of São Paulo, for example, where they set these new urban developments. Many years ago, what they do when they try to increase the density parameters in one area? Well, they give them for free. Now they are selling this new density capacity, and they are auctioning it in in the stock exchange. So we can better understand what are the windfalls that this type of land use regulation and the changes in land use regulation are generating in order to try to capture some type of a part of this additional value that these instruments are generating. And the other thing, and I think this is the last thing that I'm going to show you, is that we need to promote more monitoring and evaluation of land use regulation and how this is affecting affordability, how this is affecting the elasticity of housing supply. Some cities are trying to implement what they call a regulation assessment toolkit. And basically what it tries to do is to try to assess what are the affordability effects for the different income groups. For example, no more 300 square plot meter in a city where people cannot afford to do that, or no more low density in some part of the area in the city center where people cannot afford to do that. So these are the type of issues that we are trying to look in many cities in Latin America at this time. These are the problems, these are the policies, urban infrastructure and services. We have a lot of alternative land-based financing tools that are being implemented in different cities all over the world. We want social mixed neighborhoods. We want to reduce informality. We have to look at land use regulation and zoning. And we want to lower commuting costs and access and provide better opportunities and access to jobs. And so we have to work on this big issue of transportation and accessibility.